Hey everybody, welcome back to Black Magic Craft. We tend to get stuck in a bit of a routine when building terrain, constantly gravitating towards the same sort of shapes and form factors, tiles, buildings, ruined buildings and ruined tiles. It all gets very samey. But building terrain for Idols of Torment, this has been a godsend for my creativity. It's allowed me, actually it's kind of forced me to build terrain from a completely different perspective. I gotta get weird and wild as I build. It forces me to think outside the box, and it allows me to ignore perfection, just go crazy building stuff. Like, look at this piece that I just made. I would never have made this normally for, if I was just building D&D terrain. I've somehow ended up with this great piece for my game that would also make for an epic boss fight in any RPG. Like, imagine facing down the big villain, the hero's last stand, on this setup with this like floating rock thingy. How cool would that be? Especially if you had a bunch of these leading up to this scene. Rethinking how you build starts with rethinking what and how you use tools and materials, especially something like 3D printing. Obviously, the hobby industry has been completely taken over by 3D printing minis for gaming, but to me, the biggest advantage to this new resource is having endless, incredible bits to build terrain with. Minis sized up make for awesome foundations to builds. Well, these dudes, they were meant to flank the doorway on Loot Studio's epic Gladiator arena. But when I looked through the STL files, I realized that they were separate and not attached to the walls, which was great. This meant I could easily use them in some other way as part of the build. Now, the main message I'd like to convey with this video is that it's not only okay, but actually very beneficial to jump into a project haphazardly with no plan. I encourage you to grab material and just start hacking it up, holding pieces together, flipping them around until you see the basic shape of something cool. Eventually, a form will take shape, and then you can start to refine that form, cutting away mass to reveal something new and interesting. I'm certainly no Michelangelo, but I do like to tap into his mindset of carving away a chunk of stone to reveal the hidden bit of artwork within. Now, I can't visualize things that well ahead of time, and I don't have much in the way of sculpting ability. But what I do have is confidence and a lack of fear to just try things. Make cuts, glue stuff together, cut it some more, break it, rebuild it, and just do whatever it takes to come up with something different. If it doesn't work, just start again. Although I found this rarely happens. Usually once you get into this process, something magical takes form and the piece will eventually reveal itself. When that magic moment hits and you have an interesting form in front of you, it becomes easy to accentuate what makes it interesting by adding more elements that highlight whatever effect you are trying to achieve. I find it invaluable to constantly reassess my own tastes and bias in how I make things. Like, I used to hate bases on terrain, but after building with bases for a while, I came to appreciate them. I've come to love them so much that the game I'm designing actually has mechanics built around these large circular bases. The other mindset I've changed as a terrain builder is the fears regarding durability. Obviously, you want things to be as durable as possible, especially if they're going to be used in games. But I've come to the conclusion that it's nice to ignore that a bit and allow yourself the freedom to make delicate elements. Sometimes it's okay for a terrain piece to be a little fragile, like assuming it's going to be used by adults who are respecting it while they play with it. If you're going to make stuff for kids or a tournament, it probably is best to still err on the side of durability. I've also come to love just making my builds a little bit weird. Or a lot weird, depending on who you ask. Having the architecture not really make sense and feel a little bit off, like it comes from another world. I used to prefer building with foam in a more refined way. These days, I can't help myself from jumping into the invigorating, messy, childlike task of just slathering a piece in Sculptamold. The freeform nature of it is a great stress reliever, and it's an easy way to bring in some organic shapes and textures into a piece. When it comes to a piece like this, I don't even bother smoothing it out much. I celebrate and utilize the fibrous texture within the material, letting it hang and stick out, giving the landscape a very uninviting look. The chaos of applying texture paste with little regard for how clean and smooth it goes on can be a valuable tool if done with consideration and intent. Sometimes I think I've totally lost it and gone too far, but then I prime the piece and realize just how wonderful this little chunk of world I've built actually is. Sometimes I stare at it and realize it's not yet finished. It has more of a story to tell. It has a major missing element to make it complete. Before I jump into that, I want to take a second to talk to you about this video's sponsor, Loot Studios. One of my all-time favorite model providers, hands down. Loot offers monthly sets sculpted in a realistic scale and size. That's what I love about them. If you aren't into that more chunky, heroic scale mini style and want a more refined and believable look, Loot Studios is your best bet. The models all come pre-supported in both 32mm and 75mm scales. The 32mm models are obviously great for gaming, but the 75mm scales are awesome for using in terrain, or just display painting if that's your jam. This month's theme is the Crimson Sand Arena, an epic gladiator battle arena that you can populate with all sorts of heroes and monsters that are included. What's cool is that they've added extension pieces so you can make this arena as big as you need it to be. And if you really want to get into the vibe for a gladiator-themed game, you can even print out a 1-to-1 scale life-size sword to use as a prop, or maybe just as decoration for your game layer. I love this company. Their monthly sets on Patreon are an absurdly good value. I never have issues with their supports, and they're just a pleasure to print and paint. And they always inspire me to build something cool. I'll put a link in the description so you can go sign up for yourself. All right, so this piece of terrain was just begging for another side of that broken bridge-like stone. I thought I'd go for a floating chunk of stone. Now, this wasn't pre-planned, so I didn't have all the best stuff to do this with. I just used a wood dowel as a support rod, but really it would have been better with a metal rod, especially if it was well secured into something solid hidden in the base. But this still worked. The foam chunk on the main piece was big enough that I could embed the dowel pretty deep and get a good cantilever effect off the large circular base. I did have to cut the rod a bit shorter though, just to keep things stable. I'm considering it was a quick decision pivot. This all worked well. The rod definitely wasn't invisible, and I needed to somehow hide it. And in my opinion, the best way to hide things like this is often just to do so in plain sight. Don't try to make it invisible, instead just try to integrate it. And what a better way to do that than with a gnarly wooden bridge. It gives the appearance that both the bridge and the stone are supported by some magical means. I also textured the floating rock using this paste rather than Sculpt-A-Mold in order to keep the weight down. I knew I was onto something cool here. What a great scene for a battle. I painted this piece in the typical way that I do for most of my terrain for Idols of Torment, a zenithal highlight tinted with various colors to act as an undertone. I found that I can get a bit more adventurous with these first colors than I initially thought, as they end up getting toned down a ton in the next step. And having this variety between pieces is a nice way to bring some variance to a fairly uniform set. The magic ingredient for making these pieces is the simple dry brushing with fog gray craft paint. It blends everything together, makes the whole set cohesive, and takes down all the shine from the acrylic inks without having to use a matte varnish. I wasn't feeling the green statues though. They were cool, but I wanted them to stand out a bit more. So again, I took another pivot. I broke out some gold craft paint and just slapdash dry brush them on to turn them gold. The banners were simply painted in one pass with red contrast paint, and I messed around with some dirtied down effects, followed by the always enjoyable process of applying pigment powders made from cheap pastel sticks. I love how dusty this makes everything look. It's also a great way to hide anything in the paint job that isn't looking so hot. And that's it. By using a couple of 3D printed statues in a way they weren't intended for, and mixing it with odd shaped pieces of foam, I managed to create a unique piece of terrain that is functionally unlike any other in my collection, but aesthetically it still fits in with my most important set. I hope that you found some sort of inspiration in this video. If you liked it, hit the thumbs up button and drop me a comment below. If you want to pick up some tools or supplies, head over to blackmagicraft.ca and do your shopping through my essential equipment links to help support the channel. If you want to kick it up a notch and really help the channel out, you can do that by joining the Black Magic Craft Patreon. And of course, stay tuned for the upcoming release of my original skirmish game at idolsoftorment.com. Have a good one, everybody. See you next time.